A critical digital discourse analysis should not just analyze the text, it should also analyze the platform and how that platform shapes different platform cultures, has different moderation guidelines, because all those things have an effect on what is said, but also how it is said, when it is posted, which modes it is posted, only images, and Instagram, for instance, not being using hyperlinks, and so on. So all those things matter. So normally when we think about platforms, we think about communication, we think about platforms enabling communication. But of course, we also need to think about platforms as societal infrastructures, meaning platforms that are also not just enabling people to distribute their ideologies, but are ideological in themselves. I think a great and very obvious example is, of course, LinkedIn. LinkedIn, to most of us, is that a bit boring app that we use as a kind of online resume. But of course, if you look at that platform through the eyes of ideology, we of course see that LinkedIn is a deeply neoliberal platform. We do not celebrate birthdays on LinkedIn, no, we celebrate work anniversaries. We can only present ourselves through our work. And if you scroll through the newsfeed of LinkedIn, what you see is all people that are very happy, very proud, very excited about their job and their accomplishment. We see that this is a very obvious example, of course. Ideology is embedded in it, and you see it in the discourse, but also in the interfaces, in the affordances of that platform. But of course, the same is true of social media like Facebook or in Instagram and so on. Maybe less obvious, because in first instance, we see Instagram and we see an enormous diversity of ideologies being represented by people. Let us say from Zoran Mamdani and AOC to the golden one and far-right influences, and in everything in between. At the same time, if we look at the historical changes in those platforms, think about 2016, Donald Trump gets elected, we get the Cambridge Analytica narrative, we get the focus on hate speech, on fake news, and so on. And that pressure amounts to digital platforms increasing moderation. And so the whole trust and safety industry booms at that moment, but it also means that the ideological bandwidth narrows. A lot of far-right influences are deplatformed up until 2020, when even Donald Trump, a former president, is not able to be integrated in those platforms. So it's on that level that you see platforms functioning as ideological platforms. And this has as a result that from 2016 you see that on the far right that they start seeing those platforms as ideological platforms, and they feel the burden of moderation, deplatforming, banning, shadow banning, and as a response what they try to do is stay integrated as long as possible and just adjust their discourse in a certain way, and on the other hand start building their own platforms, what was known as alt-tech at the time, and that were platforms that were very much alt-right, visibly alt-right platforms. If we look at ideological platforms and how can we now analyze it, I think it's important to look beyond what I would call the width. The width dimension of platforms is, of course, what we commonly understand and see as the ideological dimension of platforms, namely the fact that ISIS, far-right influences, use platforms to spread their discourses, to normalize their ideologies. And the width is, of course, the superficial level, the level of the users using platforms to spread their ideologies. And that is the stuff that is mostly analyzed in research on ideology and platforms. There's a whole bunch of literature on ISIS and how ISIS used Facebook in order to normalize IDs. There's a whole bunch of literature on the far right and how they use it. But that width dimension is, of course, not all that is there. I think a second dimension that deserves our attention is the vertical dimension, meaning the focus on who now has an impact on those platforms and on what scale does one have an impact. And so you can look at this from the user perspective. The user has an impact in a certain country, but if they play it right and use English, they can also have a global impact. At the same time, there's the level of the state, of course. The state has impact. And we see that from 2016 onwards, of course, that states and supranational organizations like the European Union try to regulate digital platforms. They would issue laws, the Digital Service Act, the GDPR, that all have an impact in what becomes visible in a platform and what not. And so what you see, of course, that Google in the United States, Google in China, or Google in Europe is a very different thing, depending on the different laws that are operationalized in those different contexts. Now, we should realize here, of course, that that is ideological. We see here the old argument of Louis Althusser that media are part of the ideological state apparatus. Well, you see the same thing, of course, here. Ideas that are normal within a state. We think it's normal that ISIS should not have a place with its hate propaganda on digital media. Ergo, we have laws, and the laws come in effect, and the platforms start moderating and banning. Well, that's an ideological move, of course. It's about what is seen as normal, democracy. The violence is only violence that can be issued by the state, not by private groups, and so on and so on. So you see how ideology through the state and through laws become embedded in the platform and thus have an effect. Now, on that vertical level, we see, of course, a group that has a huge amount of impact on the larger scale, and that are, of course, the people that own the platforms. Those are not neutral people. No, they have certain ideas of what the platform should do or should not do, and they build the platforms accordingly. And this is connected, of course, that element of power they have on that vertical axle, on the highest scale, is, of course, deeply connected to that third dimension, the depth. The fact that they have power to program. They have power to code the platform in a certain way and give direction to a certain way. Saying on LinkedIn that we can only celebrate our work anniversary is a choice, of course, and it's has the effect of how it functions ideologically. Think about Instagram. Instagram imagines the world as a non-political world. We are all happy people looking at sunshines, drinking barista coffees, and so on. That is the world that is envisioned, and that becomes very visible in the type of images that we see. But it also becomes visible in the community guidelines, of course, that says, well, hard violence, if it's not incitement for violence and incitement for hatred, it can be allowed. Can be, not it is allowed, it can be, meaning the platform will decide if violence can be shown on the platform. Now, of course, the assumption here is that violence is something abnormal in people's lives, which, of course, it's not if you are living in Gaza. Because in Gaza, it's a normal way of experiencing the world around you. Deciding that this does not have a place on a social medium is, again, deeply ideological. So that width dimension, how platforms are coded and how that becomes visible in moderation policies, moderation guidelines and interfaces, affordances and so on, to analyze this in the light of how do these platforms function as ideological platforms is of crucial importance. So what you see as a reaction in 2016 on increased moderation from mainstream platforms is that the far right is building their own platforms. Things like Gap, which was and still is one of the prominent platforms there, but also Patreon as alternative spaces that enable the far right to crowdfund, but also connect with people, build opinions and so on. And what you see with those alt-tech platforms in 2016 is that, of course, most of the far-right activists want to stay integrated in the mainstream platforms. They only join those platforms at a time when they get banned, deplatformed, or as a backup, of course. Now, what you see, one of the reasons they do not want to join those platforms in first instance is because mainstream platforms have those network effects. You can reach far more people, mainstream people, by using mainstream platforms. So the alt-right platforms were still platforms in the margins, but also very much platforms that functioned as dog whistles for those very radical far-right extremists that were deplatformed from other platforms and now sought to find a space where they can, again, have their voice articulated and so on and so on. Now, those platforms, think about Gap, for instance, were very much far-right platforms. They did not try to appeal to the mainstream. No, they were very much alt-right platforms in the sense that in their logo, for instance, Gap had a frog, reflecting, of course, the Pepe, the frog meme that was very popular in 2016, 2017 among the far right. They would also use a discourse of freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is, of course, in essence, a liberal value, but especially in the last 10, 30 years, it has become a kind of dog whistle to enable and normalize racist speech as freedom of speech. And so you see that those platforms from the start in their discourse, but also in their affordances and the audiences that they attracted became far-right platforms. And I can assure you, if somebody is not a member of the far-right would enter those platforms, that would become visible from the very first page, from the very first post. The homogeneity in terms of ideological far-right homogeneous groups is very dominant in those platforms. And thus, those platforms functioned for the groups themselves, but they did not really have metapolitical value. Metapolitical value needs to be explained maybe. To understand metapolitics, we have to go back to the second half of the 20th century. I mean, we have to go back to France in 1968, where you get a group of far-right intellectuals with roots in the pro-colonialism movement of France and Algeria, of neo-Nazis and so on, that start think tank, they would call, or a school of thinking, and they would call it Grece, a group for the analysis and the study of European culture and civilization. Sounds very academic, and that is not a coincidence, because this group of intellectuals under the lead of Alain de Benoit, other prominent intellectuals are Krebs, Guillaume Fay, Dominique Venner, and so on, far-right intellectuals that made the analysis in 1968. Remember 1968, you have the students in France revolting in the streets, left-wing students. You have the anti-Vietnam movement, the anti-atomic energy movement later on. You have the black civil rights movement. And so they see all those things and they come to the conclusion, well, the left has hegemony. The left has cultural power, and if the right, and when they talk about the right, they mean the far right, the true right, and then the anti-enlightenment movement, the conservative revolution, all those ideas that were quite dominant in the 30s of the last century. If you want those ideas to become prominent again, well, we need to learn from the left. We need to learn from the left, not in the sense of taking over their ideas, but learning from the left in terms of methods and how they succeeded in becoming such prominent figures in society. And they say, well, we need to build a new right Gramscianism. To Antonio Gramsci and the idea of hegemony and the fact that the idea that intellectuals will produce new ideas in society and can normalize those ideas. Well, that is the first step in their argumentation. We need to engage in a long-term ideological and cultural battle to normalize far-right ideas. That is the essence, of course, of metapolitics. And they do this by taking the scientific format in terms of papers, in terms of conferences, books, and so on. And they use that to introduce those ideas, but in a very smart way. So, for instance, they would say, well, we are Democrats. We are full Democrats. Why? Because democracy was at the time a hegemonic concept. Positioning yourself in the public sphere as a non-democrat or even an anti-democrat will push you to the margins of society. So they say, oh, no, we are Democrats. But we are not Democrats like the left or the liberals. We are organic Democrats, meaning we are Democrats in terms of the leader speaks in name of the people. And they can speak in name of the people. Why? Because that people is one homogeneous, cultural, unified people. Only then we can speak, the leaders can speak in name of those people. And so you see here how that notion of organic democracy is in effect an attack on the notion of Jacobin or liberal democracy. A liberal democracy is about freedom of speech, is about separation of powers, it's about elections and the constitution, it's about universal human rights. Well, all those things are taken out of that notion of democracy and they injected with new. So that's the essence of metapolitics, is that long-term cultural battle that is about discourse and how we speak about things, how we attribute meaning to things. But it's also about infrastructure, of course, the congresses, the books, the websites, eventually. And I would argue, especially from 2012 onwards, we see that move from metapolitics from the intellectual sphere, the idea that the intellectuals will introduce change in ideas, towards digital culture as that vehicle that allows them to normalize their ideas. Think about the alt-right using memes in order to stretch the overtone window as the discussion went in 2016. Memes that were used to normalize radical ideas, podcasts, vlogs, influencers, and so on. And immediately understand why it was so important to be integrated in mainstream media, of course. They needed those media in order to get that discourse circulating in society and just switching the narrative, attributing new meaning to words, and just normalizing far-right ideas. In general, you could say that the far-right was using mainstream platforms in order to have metapolitical or ideological effect. They want to use those platforms to normalize those ideas. Now, of course, if you have platforms where you only find far-right people, well, you cannot normalize your ideas to a new audience. And so, in that respect, those platforms were only metapolitical to their own, in the sense of functioning as a learning environment that spread hate and violence eventually, but it never succeeded in building a platform that would reach out to a broader audience. And I think that the first time that changes is with Parler. Parler, I think, is one of the first metapolitical platforms, in the sense that it also would use that discourse on freedom of speech and frame that as a very American thing to do, but it succeeded in being a platform for at least the Republican Party in the United States. You would see that Ted Cruz, big politicians, people from Fox News and so on, would all join that platform, and all of a sudden it would become a metapolitical tool, in the sense that it was a tool that was able to reach out to people that were not the far right or the extreme far right. There were a bit broader mass, and it became a huge platform, especially up until the Capitol riots, when it was pulled down, because it had that effect of radicalization there. I think Parler is that move from alt tech towards metapolitical platform. What you see, of course, with Musk is something fundamentally new. Musk taking over Twitter, turning it into X, and that is not just a name change, of course. That change from Twitter to X is a fundamental change in how the platform operates, ideologically speaking. And you see that from the moment he takes over. Not only do we see that rhetoric about democracy and the role that that platform will have in democracy and facilitating free speech, but we also see the reversal of all kinds of bans and moderation practices from the last 3-4 years. Twitter was always a rough spot, I think. It was a place where there was fierce debate from the left, the right, and the center. But it was also the platform that invested, especially in the aftermath of the trolling of Milo and so on, 2016, 2017, invested quite a lot in moderation. It had one of the top teams, I think, in moderation of platforms. And he fired, I think, around 80% of those people. All of a sudden, Twitter became a new type of platform, because the combination of the discourse on freedom of speech and the fake news and so on that Musk was pushing into the mainstream, in combination with a fundamental change in moderation policies, unbanning Donald Trump, unbanning far-right activists and so on, it became one of those huge mainstream platforms that all of a sudden had a very ideological agenda. And we saw it immediately in the sense that a lot of the left-leaning liberal people active on that platform decided to leave. They left to, paradoxically maybe, to LinkedIn in the case of some left academics, moved to Blue Sky, to Mastodon and so on, which of course increased the homogeneity in X, but on a huge scale. X is still a platform that mainstream journalists would look at as if it's a reflection of public opinion. And what functions within and is very prominent within X would then also be something that they would like to discuss in a late night talk show or in the news and so on. So that takeover was fundamental in the sense that now far-right ideologies could become and reach out to the mainstream through a platform that they own. Metapolitical platforms is that idea that platforms are built to have metapolitical effect. So all platforms are ideological. Think about LinkedIn. We can say a lot of things about LinkedIn. It is an ideological platform, and we see the reproduction of neoliberalism within that platform, but it is not built to do this. The people that designed it thought probably about, well, this is a kind of website that is not there yet, and there will be a need for this, and it will have a function, and so on. It's not built to shift the narrative to the right or to neoliberalism. And that's different with metapolitical platforms. Metapolitical platforms are designed to do exactly that, to change the narrative, to have an ideological effect, and to switch and to move everything to the right. That was already in Parler, but it's very much clear in Rumble, for instance. Rumble was built as a free speech alternative as well, not just even of YouTube, but even of the whole internet. And if you enter that site, what you see in Rumble, in first instance, it is just YouTube with green accents instead of red accents, but then you see small differences if you look carefully. For instance, you would see that they work with editor specs. That notion of journalism where there's an editor that gives you the good news or the qualitative news. Well, you have that same thing there, but what you see is it are all far-right, pro-Trump, outrage, radio, or vlogs and podcasts. If you then, for the first time, visit Rumble, you immediately get a page where content is being served. And that's different. If you go to YouTube, you see a blank page and YouTube says, we will give you the best results as possible. Please make an account and then we'll give you information. In Rumble, you don't see this. In Rumble, you immediately see content, but at the same time, it comes with a narrative that says we do not algorithmically curate anything, which is a contradiction in terms, of course, because it shows. But the general idea is we give you everything. Everything can be said here. You can find the truth here. Even in the marketing campaigns, for instance, of Rumble, you will see that they use people like Russell Brand or Donald J. Trump Jr. as key figures, as faces of the platform in itself. So you see that it builds a consistent environment in which certain ideological ideas are being reproduced through many different ways by the users, but it is consistent. And it's built to shift everything to the right, but even more, it's also built to capitalize on that far-right audience and that more right-wing audience in terms of it is sold to advertisers as, look, we can deliver you this specific group in society. And so you see here an infrastructure that is being built to shift that whole narrative to the right, and that functions as an ideological infrastructure as its essence. You see that as well with the right stuff. So Rumble is partially financed by Peter Thiel. The right stuff is also partly financed by Peter Thiel, and that's not a coincidence. Peter Thiel has the idea, or had the idea, that big tech, meaning liberal Silicon Valley platforms, are problematic, and that there should be an alternative, an alternative in terms of far-right big tech platforms. And so Rumble is an example, The Right Stuff is another one. What is The Right Stuff? It's a far-right dating site. And if you look at how it presents itself, well, it presents itself as an alternative to all those woke dating sites. It's a place where you now can find normal dating again. And what is normal dating? Well, it's dating a conservative, of course. But it's also dating men dating women and women dating men. But no gay relationships, no LGBTQ things, no polyamorous relationships. All that is not possible. And that it's not possible because it is not made possible in the platform in itself. If you make an account in The Right Stuff, well, you make an account as a man or as a woman, but you cannot have another option. Even more, that option is presented as your sex, but your gender is not an option there. There's also not an option to indicate with whom you want to date, man or woman. No, it's assumed that you will date as a man will date a woman and vice versa. It's also assumed when you enter that platform that you are right-wing. That's the basic assumption. It's assumed that you share that idea that liberals all lie, but also that you think that the 6th of January is a great thing. And so you see here how that platform facilitates a certain ideological narrative and normalizes it into its design and into the narrative on the website and also in the uptake. Because if you look at who populates those sites, it are people that lean to the right, or at least by being and using those platforms are now turning people that lean to the right. The whole notion of ideology, of ideological platforms and metapolitical platforms, the importance is that whenever we encounter digital discourse, if you now study the far right or left-wing politicians and so on, the fact that those discourses appear on a certain platform, that we should understand that digital discourse in relation to the ideological functioning of that platform. The analysis of digital discourse is nothing new. In the last 20, 30 years, we see discourse analysts from many different subdisciplines look at digital discourse. And especially in the first wave of that discourse analysis, they looked at discourse online as if it was just text. Digital media were now an easy tool to find all those texts and we could analyze them. And you see that in the last years, it became quite obvious that there's more to it, that we need to look at the digital discourse in interaction to the norms in those platforms and so on and so on. I think that's an important move. Now, I think what is to a certain extent missing still, even in critical discourse approaches like social media critical discourse analysis of Krosnavik, which rightly so stresses we need to look at that digital discourse analysis and we need to invent new ways of dealing with this, because digital media has an effect on, for instance, the notion of a power text, where we used to look at discourse in media and assume that it was powerful because it was on legacy media. Well, that assumption is something we cannot make anymore, because social media, you not only have politicians there, but you also have common people talking there. And so what is the status now of that text? And I think if we take that notion on board and we take it seriously, I think we need to analyze it in relation to the platforms in itself. And that structure is of crucial importance. So it's not just the social political context that we need to look at, but we also need to look at the technical context, as you wish, as having a huge effect on discourse. So I think we need a critical digital discourse analysis, one that takes an approach that, in my idea, should be ethnographic. We need to look at the very specific context and the concrete situation in which discourse is being made, and that is the post of that certain person on that certain platform. But then start to scale up, and the first thing of context is, of course, that platform itself. And that means that a critical digital discourse analysis should not just analyze the text, it should also analyze the platform. and how that platform shapes different platform cultures, has different moderation guidelines, because all those things have an effect on what is said, but also how it is said, when it is posted, with which modes it is posted, only images, and Instagram, for instance, not being using hyperlinks, and so on. So all those things matter. And of course, we need social political elements as well, and I think nobody doubts that. But we also need to analyze the platform in itself, and I think that is a central element in a critical digital discourse analysis.